Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. Toto Wolff has made it clear that serious changes need to be considered to prevent a repeat of the Azerbaijan Snooze Fest. An absolutely terrible Grand Prix yesterday, barely any overtaking or action throughout the course of it. What were the reasons for that? What needs to change going forwards? And is it now clear that these new regulations have simply failed to provide better racing? Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Plenty to get into today. First of all, an update from the FIA on their investigation of themselves over the Ocon near miss that we discussed yesterday. The FIA say it will be updating the relevant procedures by Miami to ensure this situation does not reoccur. But this has happened before, right? We saw with Albon in the pit lane in Australia last year that these situations have got very close to occurring before. So we talked about it in depth yesterday, but the FIA say, don't worry guys, we've got it covered for next time. But they got away with one there for sure. Quickly on Charles Leclerc, there's some reports coming out that he now has understood how to manage the tyres better on this car. The Ferrari does still seem to eat up its tyres, certainly early on in the stint. We saw him losing a lot of time to the Red Bulls in the early part of yesterday's Grand Prix, if you can even call it a Grand Prix, given how, the lack of entertainment value. Alonso also did say after the race that Ferrari were lucky that the sun went in, because had it not have done, then Alonso reckons his tyre wear would have been better on the Aston, and it'd have been able to get Leclerc for the final podium place at the end of the race. So we'll see what happens in Miami, because it's unlikely to be cool there, and hotter track temperatures, more tyre wear, that type of stuff. Sainz was in the mud this weekend, and I'll give Sainz slightly the benefit of the doubt here, because one of the other issues with sprint weekends is that all these engineers come to the Grand Prix, they have one practice session on Friday to set up their car, and after that the car is stuck in parc ferme for the rest of the weekend. The only things you can change are the front wing angle and the tyre pressures if you really want to. Outside of that, everything else is stuck. All the suspension things are set in stone from Friday qualifying through the entire weekend. So if you didn't have the greatest setup, that's that's your lot for the weekend, unfortunately. Charles Leclerc also had some comments on the race afterwards. I think he said this in the debrief and whatever, the cool down room. For me, it was the loneliest race ever, which I'm not surprised. He must have just felt like he was out for a Sunday drive, because the Red Bulls were way in the distance. Alonso was way behind until right at the end, but Alonso caught up and made inroads. And Toto Wolff has also given similar perspectives. We'll see here in a second. The first point though Toto Wolff makes is about potentially changing the regulations. As he says here, to catch up Red Bull, either we have to do a much better job, everyone does, or change the regulations. I don't think we need to do the second one. I think we need to win on merit. Winning on merit means being more clever and having a steeper development slope than Red Bull, so I think that's fair enough and justified. But he also does talk in some detail about the state of the ground effect era cars we're now in, basically saying that he doesn't like them. So 40 racing laps, 20 seconds ahead of Leclerc, and they were pushing, right, the Red Bulls, and at the end of the race they were pretty much on the same pace as Leclerc, probably because Leclerc saved some tyres. So we're talking half a second at least a lap. That's obviously a big gap to catch up, but Toto Wolff and Mercedes are going to try and do it as the other teams are. A new front suspension and the new aero package is arriving to Imola with a new floor. He also said though that if they had enough money, they would bring an entirely new chassis. They would do a B-spec car. If they change the chassis, it's a B-spec version, which is kind of what Aston Martin did at the start of last season, but they just don't have the money to do it. And Toto Wolff says it's not about the downforce actually, it's more about the ride control. Look at some of the other cars. You can see on the onboards of the Red Bull, their car is barely moving on the straight or over bumps, whereas for our car, if we put downforce on from the Mercedes perspective, it would be too low and too stiff. Corners through balance, it looks easy. If you look at the other onboards, they look tricky to drive, but the Red Bull isn't. So clearly Red Bull have done a great job, but his opinion is, and looking at the cars across the grids, now if Toto Wolff was in the Red Bull, or like they had the dominant car of this era again, then I don't know if he'd necessarily be saying this, but he says, I generally think the ground effect cars are terrible, fill in the blanks. It's just about who has the least terrible is ahead. So, his opinion is that he doesn't like the ground effect era cars. And maybe you can understand why. They're quite tricky to balance and to drive, and the porpoising issues that occurred last time out. If everyone knew how to do what Red Bull have done, then it's probably okay. But for the majority of the cars on the grid, they don't seem as fun to drive or just as good really as the previous generation was. That's just from my personal eye test. You guys might disagree, but the benefit of the ground effect cars is meant to be that they allow for better overtaking, right? Because less of the aero and the wings is developing the downforce, rather the floor is developing most of the downforce, or at least a high percentage, then you should be able to follow more easily. But has that actually been true? I'm not so convinced. And this is the other part where he says we are more stuck than before. That's before the cost cap era, because if we were completely free, they would bring a new chassis, but of course they don't have the money to do that given the cost cap that is now in place. But that's the other side of things, right? The ground effect Maybe it has its downsides. Toto Wolff doesn't like it. The other teams, I know that Dan Fallows, even from Aston Martin, isn't really the biggest fan of these set of regulations. Red Bull probably quite like it, as does Adrian Newey, but the benefit was meant to be the cars can follow more easily. And we saw the first race of last season, Bahrain, and in races beyond, that was the case in part. But as the regulations have developed, as the floor has been raised last year or into this year by 15 or so millimeters because of to try and counter the porpoising phenomenon, and you can argue whether Toto Wolff was responsible for that occurring, but I think regardless of whether Toto Wolff and Mercedes pushed for TD39 and pushed for these floor edge raises, all the cars would naturally have innovated to put every single ounce of downforce on the car they possibly can, and that is largely outside of the floor, right? Last season, the cars were overweight. They were predominantly focused on developing the floor of the car. This year, naturally, the cars were going to get faster, and they were going to put on every single piece of downforce onto the bodywork that they could, and therefore, yet again, dirty air has become more of a phenomenon. At the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, there were, depending on the metrics you use, potentially only 13 on-track passes. Hamilton had almost a third of those. And, okay, so the numbers are slightly different depending on which way you analyze it, whether you include the first lap or passes during the safety car period, all this stuff. But if you look at it from a consistent perspective, look at the passes in the last several years, 2016, 2017, 2018. Okay, some chaotic races back then. 2019 had 62, and then since 2021, nothing really has happened, and it had the same amount this year as last year. The sprint even almost had more passes than the race itself, which is remarkable to think about. And even this is factoring in that Nico Hülkenberg and Esteban Ocon towards the end of the race were on pretty much 50-lap-old tyres. So they were sitting ducks, and Hülkenberg got overtaken 4 or 5 times, while Haas were hoping for a red flag or a safety car so they could pit him. That never came, so they left him out in the hope of potentially snagging a point. Didn't happen, and without that, it would have been in the single digits, right? And maybe by some metrics, it already is in the single digits. And just look at this. I mean, this is just painful to look at, right? But these are the positions at the start of the race, and we can see after the safety car, basically nothing happened from them for the rest of the Grand Prix. Obviously, Hamilton made a good recovery after the safety car. There were some factors here, right? So the softs and the mediums, they were dead immediately. And I think the sprint race actually hurts the quality of the Grand Prix this weekend, because the sprint race for most of the teams was just a practice session. They went into the sprint to find out, do the softs work? Do the mediums work? How long will they last? And what should the situation be for the race? If the teams didn't know that the softs were terrible, if they didn't know that the mediums would fall off quickly, as they knew after the sprints, then we might have had a very different Grand Prix, because the teams would have gone into the Grand Prix. Maybe some of the top teams would have chucked the softs on the car, hoping that it was going to work, thinking that it would, and then it would have backfired, and who knows what could have happened. But everyone knew after the sprints that Leclerc was screwed. First of all, that was very evident, and everyone knew that the softs were going to die within a few laps, and everyone knew the mediums weren't going to last that long either, so the medium hard was going to be the way to go. And the safety car came at the worst possible time, because it just came in the pit window when everyone was going to pit anyway, so they did and went to hards on a one stop. So it couldn't really have been any worse. There was no rain, and look, one stop dry races are always going to be bad enough, especially around what I consider to be not a particularly good circuit like Baku. Yes, Hamilton made a good recovery drive, but still, I think he was faster than Sainz. I think that was very evident. Usually, if a driver's following closer to a car in front for several laps, they usually got more pace. But he wasn't able to get the move done, largely because there was just no opportunity to overtake. The DRS straight was much shorter than before. There was not enough time to actually make that move happen, and Toto Wolff has given his thoughts on it as well. Today, it wasn't a thriller. I think that's very evident. Just no overtaking, even with a big pace difference. It made it not great entertainment. We have to analyze the weekend with the sprint format, where there are positives that we can take out, but in the end, it comes down to racing. It needs the tough battles, and I think the highlight was the sprint. Russell versus Verstappen being able to battle it out, literally lap 1, corner 2. There was none of that today. Even if you were within a couple of tenths, it was very difficult to overtake, nearly impossible to overtake unless the other driver makes a mistake, as happened with Stroll. We need really to look at it and find out how we can avoid a boring race. And I think this is a very, you can argue, okay, it's Toto Wolff's fault or whatever for making the regulations like this, but this was a development that was going to happen anyway, regardless of the small regulation changes going into this year. The teams were going to put more downforce on the car, they were going to get faster, and more downforce equals more dirty air, unless you've got like a fan car or something with a complete vacuum under the floor. So this was somewhat inevitable, and as he says, it wasn't the right thing, says Sergio Perez, to shorten up the DRS. Perez says by generating that more downforce, the car behind struggles to follow more. It's harder to overtake than last year already, so shortening the DRS based on last year's Grand Prix was not the wisest thing to do, because it basically killed any chance chances of overtaking into turn 1, unless you're a Red Bull with the phenomenal DRS that they have. And I think this is the key point from Toto Wolff, right? That there's all this talk from Formula 1 about, oh, the sprint races, changing up the practice sessions, giving points for practice. I'll put the quali here, put the sprint shootout in here. And it's like, well, fundamentally, focus on the sprints, but the real focus should be on, is the racing actually good? Do we get good Grand Prix on the Sunday? Does the sprint race dilute the feeling of the weekends? Do you get to Sunday and nothing happens because the cars can't follow easily and you've shortened the DRS zones and we're driving on these terrible street tracks? The next few tracks are Miami, Imola, which isn't a great track we're overtaken anyway. Then it's like Monaco, and then Spain is in there. And Spain's, you know, I think hopefully with the changes to the final corner will be better, but still, Spain historically not many overtakes. And those are your next 4 tracks. So, man, it's not looking pretty right now. I think after the race this weekend, we must not talk it down overall and say that it's the wrong direction in terms of the sprint weekends, but it's about understanding why was it not entertaining. The Red Bulls sailed into the sunset, and then there's a 20-second gap. You're stuck where you're stuck, and that is it. As he even says, I don't know who was faster, Aston, Ferrari or Mercedes. Who was faster? I don't know, because we didn't really get the chance to see because the drivers were stuck in position. So what needs to change? There's a big debate on this. Have the regulations straight up not gone the right way? Fundamentally, the cars are too big, right? And I know in 2026 they want to shorten them and make them thinner and smaller and potentially lighter, right? Like they were back in the day, but Formula 1 just doesn't feel the same now than it used to, and especially with, in my opinion, bad tracks like Baku, with a short DRS zone is just making the race absolutely atrocious to watch and barely even felt like a race. It was a straight up recession, and even the driver said that the shortened DRS zone was to blame for this. There was a few interesting quotes actually I'll share. The overtaking this year is harder than last year. The cars have evolved away from the initial regs that F1 introduced. Overtaking is more difficult, and because they shortened the DRS zones, that was something the drivers had no input on. The drivers didn't get to choose. Like the FIA didn't say, hey, do you want to shorten the DRS or not? They were like, we're doing it. And he's like, yeah, I'm a little disappointed we weren't in the loop to hear that, because I'm not even sure the FIA are aware that we feel that overtaking is harder, yet they're basing DRS off last year's information, which is a valid point. Lando Norris also says pretty much impossible to overtake. All the drivers questioned why they shortened the DRS zone by 100 meters in the driver's briefing. The cars are getting more complex. The involvement in aerodynamics is causing it to be harder to follow. So if anything, it should be the same or longer. So big debate on this one. Lewis Hamilton also gave his thoughts and says Baku was fun in the past years with the DRS as it was, but then someone changes something randomly for no reason at all, and it killed the Grand Prix. So a few reasons that I think we've discussed here why yesterday's wasn't great. I think there's a few things they've got to consider in the short term. It seems that Formula 1 is very keen on making this more of a show, right? They want all the glamour and the glitz and all this, like we're going to have in Miami in a week or so's time. But fundamentally, the racing needs to be good. That's what people are here for. And if they are going to mess around with things like sprint formats and sprint shootouts and all this for, you know, the entirety of the 3 days of the weekends, then why not consider other changes, right? Why not mandate 2 stops in a Grand Prix? What if every team had to run all of the compounds, the soft, the medium, and the hard during the race? Now, unless it was raining maybe. And of course, there's some issues with that and controversies, but it's like they're changing a lot about the sport. And it seems to me they're going to have to try and consider things that are relatively radical, and maybe regulation changes in the near future to even take a step back from where we presently are, just because right now it's not a good time. The season feels like a foregone conclusion, and we have races like that don't even feel like they're worth tuning in for. So very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comment section below. What should be done about this? Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.